What is within day energy deficit? Have you ever even heard of this? Well, today on the podcast, we're going to answer exactly that question and really fill in the context of why this matters for women athletes. By the time this podcast is over, you'll know conceptually what within day energy deficit is and why it matters to you as a female athlete. Welcome back to the podcast. Thank you so much for being with me today. I'm really excited that you're here. We have just come back from a bit of a break, and so unofficially kicking off a new season of the podcast. And I'm so very excited to continue exploring these topics about fueling your strength. We have in the past few episodes been looking at some things regarding metabolism. We've looked at overall energy balance and why these things really matter for women, particularly athletic women like yourself. So today we're going to be diving into this topic about within day energy deficit. If you're like me, maybe several years ago, you had never heard of this topic, and it's sort of an offshoot of the idea of making sure that you are adequately fueled. So we're really going to be diving into that today on the show. A couple of things though, before we go any further. First is to hit that subscribe button on your favorite app. It is really so important, and it is a free and easy way to show your support and your love for this podcast. Also, if you listen to this episode and you realize, well, I would really like some help and coaching with this from an expert and get the support that I need to put these principles into practice, really put them into a cohesive system that works synergistically in terms of fueling, training, and recovery, then I'm going to invite you to apply for Strength Nutrition Unlocked. You can do that at stephgaudreau.com/apply. Okay, so let's go ahead and give a little bit of a background on within day energy deficit and why we're covering this topic on the podcast. Couple things. First of all, women athletes especially are just bombarded with ideas about eating less, moving more, and a lot of nutrition strategies that you'll see out in the world that really aren't made for us. So there's that. The second thing is that adult learners really need to understand the why, the rationale behind things. And a lot of times on social media, when we're talking about, eat less or eat more, don't eat less, we're going to reject that. And we're really looking at how we can take our nutrition to the next level. We oftentimes say things like eat more protein and we need carbohydrates and don't be afraid to fuel. And really, that's easy when we're talking about these pithy one-liners. But when it comes to the nuance and the context, those things need to be teased apart. And that's really what we do here on the podcast, to give you the rationale, to go into depth, to explain why this stuff matters for us, and to really fill you in. And same thing on the articles that we've been writing on the website. So definitely head over and check those out as well. Like everything else in nutrition, there's a simple answer to this issue, which is TLDR, eat meals regularly throughout the day to help support your training and your recovery. But then there's also this very nuanced answer that takes unpacking and looking at the layers so you are more confident in your understanding and you can move forward with that and implement these principles, and you are less likely to fall back on the pressures of eating less and cutting way back and doing these very large caloric deficits, which are not going to serve your training and your overall health and well-being. So, it's really interesting when we consider the broad brushstrokes here. Over the past decade or so that I've been in this field, the scene has really exploded. There's so much more information now. We have tons of podcasts about nutrition. There are so many more women lifting heavy, which is amazing. And on the same token, the flip side, I guess, of that is that there is so much more to wade through. And a lot of what you see on social media, you hear on podcasts, you see on websites, isn't necessarily tailored to you as a very active athletic woman who's challenging your body, you care about performance, you want to build strength, you're working on your endurance, your capacity, you want to add muscle to your frame, all of these things, we really need to think about the mainstream nutrition advice you might be seeing, even for other people in our age bracket. Let's just say that much, who might not be active and athletic. We have to sort of sift through that. And this is one of those things that you might be challenged by as we go through this today. Remembering that step one, first and foremost, of sports nutrition and performance nutrition is really looking at making sure you as the athlete have an adequate energy intake. So yes, at some level, we're dealing with calorie intake, how many calories we're expending, what the balance is of that. And at the same time, we also need to take a look at the next level down, I guess, or up, however you're looking at this, is how those calories are being partitioned, how they're coming in throughout your day, and really understanding it also at a macronutrient level. So stay tuned for a future podcast series that I'm going to be doing about protein. So we're going to be kind of kicking it off with that. So first things first, we're going to talk about kind of the overall overarching idea of what is within day energy balance? Why does it matter to us? What is within day energy deficit? What are some of the things that stand in the way of us when we think, yeah, but I am eating enough? We'll get into that, and then kind of leave you with some, again, broad brushstrokes about what do you do about this. So I want you to take this podcast today with the idea of really looking at this as a conceptual podcast, a conceptual level, not obsession. The last thing we need to do is to stress you out, to make you obsess about getting things perfect. That is not the goal here. The goal here is that you understand why when you see people like me out on social or in the newsletter or wherever it is listening to this podcast, and we're talking about, long periods of fasting for athletic women who are training hard with intensity is not a great match. You have the conceptual understanding about, oh, now I know why that is. And so you can then work on putting the habits and practices into place in your own life so that we're bridging the gap between what we say and why it matters for you. So specifically, we're going to dive in here looking at this idea of what is within day energy balance. So a couple things. We can be much more nuanced above and beyond just saying we need adequate energy intake, which we do, by really talking about the types and quantities of calories that we're targeting. And we're looking at things like protein, carbs, and fats. Alcohol is a macronutrient, but for our purposes, we are not including that in our discussion. So specifically, we're really looking at the idea when we're talking about energy balance of considering protein energy, the energy we eat via protein, against non-protein energy, which is carbohydrate and fat, again, for our purposes. So in my experience as a coach, as a nutritionist, many athletic women just don't have a good concept of what enough energy is, both in terms of caloric intake, how many calories, which, by the way, is a fluctuating number. It's never perfect every single day. But also thinking about how do we translate that into food on the plate? Because you eat food on the plate, right? You don't just eat calories or macronutrients. You eat food that contains those things. So all too often, what I see is active women who train a lot, unfortunately, default to very low caloric intakes that aren't even sufficient for children and toddlers. Let's be frank here. And we're really talking about the 1,200 calorie diet, or even just eating a significant energy deficit in the context of trying to train and perform at a higher level. Okay, so sometimes I'll say this to women athletes and they're training really, really intensely, really hard, really pushing their bodies. And they're like, yeah, but I don't eat 1,200 calories, but they're still at a significant energy deficit. So we're not going to get into things like fat loss and what that entails and energy deficits, because that's not the purpose of this podcast. But suffice to say, if you're trying to create a deficit and that deficit is extreme, especially compared to your basic needs and your energy activity, we're going to see you ending up in a place, especially if you're doing this for long periods of time, where your metabolism is going to adapt and compensate downward, and you don't want that. So that's a little bit of an aside. So what is within day energy balance? Let's just start by framing that, so then we can then go into what is the deficit piece of that. So what not a lot of people are really talking about, I even see this in kind of the sports and performance nutrition space, is that how you distribute your energy intake. And when I say energy, I mean calories. How you distribute your calories or energy over the course of your day is as important as making sure you're eating enough by the 24-hour mark in the first place. So yes, you could be eating enough as assessed over a 24-hour period, and we might call that energy balance, daily energy balance. However, if your within day energy balance is significantly off, you're spending far too many hours within your day in an energy deficit, there can be negative impacts to your performance, and potentially, again, if this is going to be a consistent thing, impacts on your health and overall well-being. And I regularly see this a lot when clients come in. They've been operating from a state of low energy availability. I definitely know what that feels like. That was me 10, 11 years ago. And as a result, when you're in this chronic low energy availability state, you're also more at risk for relative energy deficiency in sport. We have done podcasts on both of those, so we'll link those in the show notes. You can go back and check those out. A low energy availability occurs, just as a quick reminder, when your energy intake, after you account for how much energy is spent during intentional physical activity or training, is not enough to fully meet the remaining needs of the body. And these basic needs are things like your gut function, bone health, maintenance of muscle mass, reproductive function, amongst other things. So over time, these systems are not operating at their best. And we start to see implications, again, whether that's to our training, our performance during training, our performance during competition, if we are competing, and potentially over time, those relative energy deficiency in sport outcomes. So now we're going to move into this idea of within day energy deficit. So if the energy balance is sort of where we stand after 24 hours, within day energy deficit is going to talk about big chunks of time in your day when you're spending in an energy deficit. How do we put this in common language? You are not eating for large chunks of your day. And that might not even be intentional fasting, which for, I would say most athletic women, even if you're in your 40s or beyond, is just not the best way to approach your fueling. Now, somebody could prove me wrong here by talking about their own unique situation, but broad brushstroke wise, this idea of especially training in the morning and not eating before, during, or after for several more hours is not helping you to see the progress that you want. Whether it's your strength numbers, it is your cardio efficiency, it is your ability to build and maintain muscle, which we know is more difficult, not impossible, but is more difficult as we are aging through perimenopause and then into postmenopause. Okay. And we've done a whole episode specifically where we went into intermittent fasting with Dr. Stacy Sims. You can absolutely go and listen to that one. It is a barn burner. Just go check it out. All right. So let's create an analogy to help you understand within day energy deficits a little bit better. So think about your phone battery. This is not a perfect analogy, but we're just going to run with it. It automatically goes into power saving mode reducing function and performance so that there's sufficient battery charge or energy left to support basic functions for slightly longer. So if you start to run that battery down, it's going to start to power down in the background, especially less important tasks. So I know for me, when my battery runs really low on my phone, it stops sort of uploading or updating my, photos to the cloud automatically until I plug it in, right? Those sorts of things. So think about that as you start your day. You have your phone fully charged, and by the end of the day, maybe your phone is fully depleted. What that doesn't always tell you, unless you look at the little screen that tells you your usage, is it doesn't tell you a lot about what happened in between 100% charge and zero. So for example, your battery charge might drop from 100% to 20% in a very short space of time. Maybe you're running a really energy hungry app, Instagram, looking at you. Then maybe your phone for the rest of the day spends the day in power saving mode, reducing function and performance until you charge it again. This is a different scenario than a fully charged phone that has its battery slowly decrease evenly across the day. And maybe, at night, you of course have to top it up, but function is sort of maintained throughout the day because it hasn't taken this giant hit. So if you simply looked at energy in versus energy out, which is of course kind of the foundation of any kind of performance nutrition and really looking at energy balance in general, if you looked at that after 24 hours, you would probably miss out on some important within day details. In other words, even though there might be energy balance by the end of the day, very large chunks of your day might be spent in a negative energy balance. We see this pattern a lot, especially when people are not used to eating breakfast. They've done fasting for a period of time in particular, either purposefully or just because their day is really busy. Then lunch is also a little bit meager and you're busy, you're working through Zoom meetings, or it's just chaotic. So you spend a good chunk of your day with very little energy coming in. And that's what we're really talking about here. If you are doing intense training and not refueling until hours afterward, you are continuing to stay in a breakdown state. I don't know how else to tell you that, but I hear this quite often from women who are still not ready to let go of fasting. And again, contextually, we're talking about people doing intense training, lifting heavy weights, doing HIIT training, doing hard interval training, cardio training, those sorts of things. So when you do your training, especially in the morning, and then afterwards you do not eat because you're continuing through the fast, you are staying in a breakdown state. And when this happens for hours and hours afterwards, this is unfavorable for many things, recovery in general, but also we're looking at the lack of essential amino acids to even put into the process of muscle protein synthesis. So you're working out very, very hard, and then you're not giving your body the raw material, the building material it needs for many hours later. Now, do you have to stress and try to get your post-workout protein within 15 minutes or something bad's going to happen? No, but I'm talking about day in, day out. You're spending many hours without putting any fuel, any raw material, any amino acids, be it protein in your body. You're wondering, why has it been difficult for me to build muscle mass? This is one of the reasons why, or one of the reasons I see very commonly. Okay, so we need, as female athletes, to be very cautious about introducing very large caloric deficits for long periods of time. I'm talking about many months and years due to what we know about low energy availability and red S. So the question becomes, what does research say about this? What are some of the effects? And I've already alluded to this, but let's go into it a little bit more. So typically people will look at their 24-hour energy intake total, whether you're just using MyFitnessPal or you're just thinking about it in your head. But this 24-hour assessment doesn't allow you to see what's happening within your day. Now you could, use MyFitnessPal and look sort of meal to meal, and that would give you a good idea. But what we don't think about is that when we're considering that, like, did I get enough energy did I eat enough in my day? And we're only thinking about the end of the day and seeing what the total is. This tends to not take into consideration real-time responses that occur in your body with either large energy surpluses, which is extra, or large energy deficits. So I'll give you a quick example here. If somebody is going to eat a large dinner, but ate very little over the day leading up to it, which is a common pattern I see with intentional or otherwise non-intentional fasting, this may mean that you're spending a large chunk of your day in a significant energy deficit. Let's say you're able to eat an isocaloric amount, which is you're meeting your energy needs pretty much spot on. So it looks like, let's say you need 2,000 calories, you might hit that total, even though maybe your food intake was like 200, and then 1,600. And that's a little bit of an extreme example, but I do see that quite often. And really what I see in my female athletes that I work with is that it's 200 calories, and then fuck. It's really hard to eat enough food in the last meal to account for the gap that was created from the rest of the day. So what that means is consistently, if this is chronic and happens over a long period of time, consistently, chronically under eating. There was a study that was done, and we can link this. It was done on female soccer players. We'll put the link in the show notes to the study. But let's think about why that might not be favorable. Here's a quote from the study. It says, such an eating pattern would produce low blood sugar during the day, which would result in an elevated serum cortisol that is associated with low bone mineral density, catabolism of lean mass, and reduction in estrogen production. To compound these problems, the low blood sugar is likely to result in a hyperinsulinemia response at the next eating opportunity. So again, we're not just thinking about the impact of kind of not eating, but we're also talking about what happens when we start to eat again after those long gaps of time. None of these possible outcomes could be adequately predicted through a 24-hour energy balance assessment, and none are desirable for the athletes. They also mentioned greater food consumption than normal, which a lot of you sort of experience in a very anecdotal way, where you don't eat very much at breakfast, or if at all, or maybe you're just drinking coffee. You eat very, very little at lunch, and then you're like, holy shit, all I want to do is eat the pantry. And now I've ended up overstuffed and feeling terrible. And now I feel like crap the next day even. So I see this happening a lot, and you may have noticed this as well. And what we're really looking at here, again, is being in that long breakdown state for long periods of time. There's another study that says traditional multiple day energy balance and energy availability assessments can mask the energy deficiency by the compensation effect, while within day energy balance can detect the hidden energy deficiency with more physiological reference. So this is a 2017 study that looked at the masking effect of within day energy deficits in female athletes, specifically looking at menstrual function and athletic performance. In women with higher within day energy deficits, estrogen levels were lower and cortisol levels were higher. The women also showed signs of a suppressed metabolic rate. Perhaps the most surprising is that when the women with menstrual dysfunction were compared to those without, meaning normal menstrual function, there were no differences in the total energy consumed over a 24-hour period. So the two groups had roughly equal, by the end of the day, energy intake. It was just that the group that was not eating much across the day and then maybe ate a big meal, I don't remember the exact timing of the meals in the study, but in the athletes that had a within day energy deficit, those were the ones that had menstrual dysfunction. So I said, but those women with menstrual dysfunction did have larger within day energy deficits. So here's a couple now kind of moving into this idea of a couple of the rebuttals that I hear a lot. The first one, and they're both along the lines of, but I do eat enough. So if you're like, but I eat a lot, let's kind of dissect this. Number one, oftentimes when I hear this, it's because of what I'm dubbing the last meal effect, which means if you eat very little at breakfast or not at all, because some of us are still doing that, us, not me, us meaning you collectively. I used to do this though. So side note, sidebar, I used to do this. All right, I get it. I know, I get the whole situation. This is why I'm kind of nudging you to reconsider, because I know what it's like and I know how much better things are on the other side. So I say this with love. But oftentimes we see very small or none at all breakfast, very small or none at all lunch, big dinner, and so, or relatively larger meal for dinner. So there's a tendency to remember only the last meal at the end of the day and think, yeah, that I ate a lot. Sometimes even your sleep is kind of disrupted because you've eaten more in the late evening and you don't sleep all that well because of the digestion that's actively taking place and the fullness that you feel. So there is sometimes still these big gaps in energy throughout your day, and you have the tendency to only remember the last meal. So that's number one. Number two, I see this one a ton. This is when we're eating a lot of high volume, but low energy foods. So we see this even with women athletes who eat a lot of like small meals or a lot of small meals plus snacks. This is not a knock on snacking, by the way, at all, but it's just an interesting observation. So there was a study done, again, we'll link to this in the show notes. And what they saw in the study was that women who were eating a higher meal frequency in the population that they looked at, so a lot of meals, that's meal frequency, was associated with greater within day energy deficits. And the authors postulated, this might be due to athletes consuming low energy density foods or quote unquote safe snacks. So just a little bit of an aside here, the concept of safe foods also occurs in disordered eating and eating disorders. And if you're somebody who is struggling with this, please see the NEDA. We will link that in the show notes for resources and support. So suffice to say, you could be a snacker and snack lots across your day, but eat lots of high volume, that means filling foods that have less energy. And we're talking about things like filling up on a lot of fibrous raw vegetables or adding a lot of fiber to smoothies to bulk them out and keep the calories low. Snacking on low carb or sort of like low protein bars. Again, nothing wrong with energy bars or protein bars at all. Or eating too many low calorie foods. So we see this a ton, and it's actually a little bit more insidious because you feel like, but I am eating a lot. Okay, before we go any further, fiber is very important for gut health and for keeping you regular and so many other things. It is very important to get enough fiber, and most Americans do not get enough fiber. So we're not knocking vegetables here. We just have to find a better balance where we are also including enough energy dense foods, calorically dense foods. And I see this a ton with women who are like, but I eat lots of salads. And then we look at the salad and it's a lot of veg, not necessarily a bad thing, but then there's not much protein in the salad and there's really not a dense source of carbohydrate besides the fibrous vegetables. So I also see this in my sort of former low carb people. Again, that was me, where you've made some low carb switches with food in your past. And now you are still kind of using the same habits, right? You've got habits with food buying, habits with the recipes you like to make, habits with food prep or meal prep or recipes that you're cooking. And it can take time to readjust your idea of bringing more, especially carbohydrates back in. So let's say you're somebody who is not celiac or doesn't have celiac disease. You have no celiac disease. And you're like, well, I just was, I just got the idea that I shouldn't eat bread. Bread is bad for me, or pasta is bad for me, or rice is bad for me. And these foods can absolutely and do absolutely have a place. However, you've learned to omit them from your routine. So let's say, for example, you do lettuce wrap instead of bread. You do cauliflower rice instead of rice. You do zucchini noodles instead of pasta. And yes, you are increasing the vegetable content of what you're eating, but by proxy, you've cut back on the energy that's available. So I would just say, if you fall into that camp, be more conscious of, if you are eating, you are a snacker, great, that's fine. We just want to make sure that you're not eating like very low energy in those snacks. Every snack is 150 calories. Well, you're eating 6 snacks a day, but that's still going to leave you very low on energy intake overall. So that was kind of another issue that was raised in one of these studies, and I see a lot anecdotally out in the community. So what we want to think about here and give you the takeaways for is this. All right, so kind of recapping where we've covered a lot of ground here in this episode. I want to leave you with some takeaways and put a bow on it. So the first thing is that, yes, daily energy requirements, it's important to eat enough. However, how we spread that energy out throughout the day does matter. And we want to avoid these very long stretches of time where we're going without food throughout our day, especially after we're training hard and our body is primed for recovery. Yes, recovery takes place on the continuum. However, that is not an excuse for just waiting several hours before you're refueling after your training. You're going to train so much better when you are properly refueled and you're doing it in a timely fashion. Don't obsess, don't get crazy about it, but just try to be a little bit more diligent, right? We talked about within day energy deficit and some of the impacts that can have on not only performance, but also health and well-being overall. And we also talked about some of the reasons why it may seem like, or you feel like you're eating enough, but that those can be a little bit tricky. And that was specifically in regards to that last meal effect, and also eating lots of high volume, high fiber, but low energy intake or low energy, low calorie food. So even if you're snacking a lot, but the caloric value is too low, that can kind of get a little bit muddy. So try, and here are your takeaways, try to eat enough to fuel your training and basic bodily needs, and spread that out throughout the day a little bit more evenly to avoid those big gaps, to avoid that within day energy deficit. Try to refuel in a timely fashion. And as a female athlete, try to go into your training with some fuel on board. Again, particularly those of you who are doing intense training, you're lifting heavy, you're doing high intensity interval training, going out there and running really fast, like all of these things, go into your workout with a little bit of fuel on board, especially if that workout is happening in the morning. Even if it's a snack, it's better than nothing. Okay, you don't need to wake up 4 hours early and eat a hungry man breakfast. Shout out to anyone who remembers what those are. But just think about getting some fuel on board and then refueling in a timely manner. Okay, very, very important. So we'll kind of summarize it by saying this. Nutrition is complicated, even for us as athletic women over 40. We've been fed a diet, no pun intended, of statements about how we should eat, what we should eat less, move more. And it's complicated to weed or not weed through it. Yeah, I guess weed through it is what I would say. It's complicated to make your way through the information and continually come back to you and your context. No, we don't want to overeat, but we also don't want to drastically undereat. We need to find that sweet spot. And a lot of times we're only going to get there through experimentation and awareness. So remember, the mission here is to fuel, train, and recover smarter so you build fitness, strength, endurance, capacity, and muscle, because feeling stronger and more powerful translates into a more expansive life outside the gym. Your strength is a catalyst for more. All right, that does it for this episode on Within Day Energy Deficit. A couple things. First of all, hit the subscribe button on your podcast app. It's so important. It helps to share the love about the podcast, and it is a free and really easy way to show your support. If you love this episode or you found it helpful in some way, share it out on Instagram stories and tag me at Steph_Gaudreau so I can see it and then share that back out into the world. And share it with a friend. If you know somebody could use this episode, please send it to them. So hopefully they're able to take a listen and learn just as well. Thanks for being here on this podcast episode. I will see you next time. And until then, stay strong.